Your good buddy and mine, Robert Francis, goes full tyrant during a town hall meeting. Protecting America from Assault Weapons. That is the name of the hearing that the House Judiciary Committee held on their proposed assault weapons ban legislation. We'll talk about that, and we'll follow up on something that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said about slavery. And then Sleepy Joe's campaign is officially over. It just doesn't know it yet. But not for the reasons you may think are the most obvious. And we'll have another episode of The Galactically Stupid. We'll get into all of that and more. I'm Big E, and this is the Liberty Cast. So before we get into the explosive news of this week, I have to follow up on AOC and her utterly ridiculous statement about slavery in D.C. Remember this?
On April 16th, 1862, through the Compensation Emancipation Act, it was the District of Columbia that was the first to free enslaved people in the United States of America.
Now, she's clearly not a student of history. She's clearly not very smart. But you would think that if she's going to get up there and make these assertions, that she would at least consult Google and get her facts straight. And I know that's asking too much. I know. But this is just so utterly ridiculous and so easily debunked. You would think that at this point, this far into her term, as many times as she's been debunked, that she would learn. But she didn't. So she claimed that DC was the first, and I don't even know what, first something to free slaves. Okay. Vermont was actually the first state, sovereign territory after the War for Independence in 1777 to make it a part of their constitution to outlaw slavery. 1777. In 1780, Pennsylvania enacted the Gradual Emancipation Act, where children who were born to slaves were considered free. Now, they didn't free the slaves right then and there. It was called the Gradual Emancipation Act. But then in 1783, all slaves in Massachusetts were freed because the state Supreme Court ruled that slavery was unconstitutional, according to the Massachusetts state constitution. As a result, Maine, which was part of Massachusetts at that time, and was a free state when it entered the Union in 1820. And then there's the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory, which was Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and I believe Michigan, and I think maybe Kentucky. I can't quite. Maybe I need to consult Google. But come on. She is so woefully out of her depth. It almost defies description. I mean, what did she say during her campaign to get? She didn't get very many people to vote, but she got enough to win. There were a lot of people that just did not vote. I mean, 20,000 votes or something like that were cast, and she won by some ridiculous, whatever it was. I don't have it in front of me right now, but not a lot of people voted. But what did she say to get the people who did vote to vote? I'm mystified. Every time she opens her mouth, every time she says something as stupid as this, and this might be the dumbest thing she's ever said. There's a hell of a list, don't get me wrong. But, wow, I don't understand. I do not understand. Anyway, I just wanted to go into a little more detail of that because it was in our Galactically Stupid segment last week, and I didn't get a chance to really expand on it. So I wanted to make sure that we understood that she is she's just completely could not be more wrong if she said 2 + 2 = orange. And I wouldn't put it past her to say that. Anyway, moving on. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The left is hell-bent on infringing on those rights. I was reminded of a quote this week, and I'll share with you that quote in a bit, but this quote perfectly sums up what the left is trying to do. Now, the left has always been on the side of gun control. They've always been trying to disarm the people. And the idea of wanting to confiscate guns is not new. It's been their goal for decades.
If I could have gotten 51 votes in the Senate of the United States for an outright ban, picking up every one of them, Mr. and Mrs. America, turn them all in, I would have done it. I could not do that. The votes weren't here.
That was Senator Dianne Feinstein in 1995 discussing the assault weapons ban. Now, Robert Francis has gotten a lot of press lately for his outburst at the debates last month, but he was hardly the first Democrat presidential candidate to come out for stealing your guns.
First, ban and buy back every single assault weapon in America. I'm the only candidate calling for that.
That's a good one.
That will go a long way.
Obviously, he's out of the race now, but that's not going to stop him. I mean, this is the same guy who threatened to nuke citizens who didn't want to give up their guns when he was first floating this ridiculous idea. And then we have this.
Hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15, your AK-47. We're not going to allow it to be used against our fellow Americans anymore.
Now, I know it's been said all over the place now, you can't buy back something you never owned. But it's worth repeating because it's so obviously true. Yet the left insists on using this language. The government's not buying them back. The government is stealing them, or at least would be if Robert Francis and his ilk got their way. Yeah, they're tossing you a little bit of cash. They're not going to pay you what they were worth, especially if for the people who've modified them and added things to them and upgraded them. They're not going to pay you fair market value. There's no way. They can't afford it. And just imagine in our worst possible nightmares, they managed to gain power again. And they had the presidency, the House, and the Senate, and they packed the court. You're talking 93 trillion for the Green New Deal. You're talking 34 trillion for universal health care. And who knows whatever other programs they're going to come up with. Where is the money going to come from to buy all these weapons? There's not enough money to pay for those two programs in and of themselves. Ridiculous. Now, I don't know if you remember one of Eric Swalwell's campaign messages. He copied Christine O'Donnell's campaign message where she said, "I am you." He took that and ran with it. So if he is us includes Robert Francis. Now, remember when I talked about a little while ago, Eric Swalwell threatened to nuke people who didn't want to comply with his proposed law? Well, Robert Francis took it a step further, and he says that we don't have the right to stand up against a tyrannical government.
In my reading of U.S. history, we settled this question about whether we should be able to rise up against our government in 1865 in a courthouse in Appomattox, Virginia. Right now, if you wanted to arm yourself sufficient to take on a government that spends $750 billion a year on its military, which is larger than the 10 largest military budgets combined that follow ours, we're going to need more than an AR-15.
Wait. Hold. There's more, but I have to stop it there and address this. Now, just to refresh your memory, Appomattox was where General Robert E. Lee surrendered his army to General Ulysses S. Grant. So what he's saying, what Robert Francis is actually saying is, there's no point in rising up against a tyrannical government. So A, he's conceding that he's planning on running a tyrannical government. And B, you don't have a choice but to surrender. Bend over, take it. That's what he's saying. At least he's honest. The rest of them, not so much. But he goes on.
We're going to need some aircraft carriers, some nuclear submarines. But I hear you in your reading of the Bill of Rights and the Second Amendment, that's your interpretation of it. The consequence of that is that we now have military-grade weapons, more than 10 million of them, in the hands of our fellow Americans, not latently waiting for use against the government, but being actively used against us in our communities, in our churches, in synagogues, out on a Saturday night partying and having fun in downtown Dayton or at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas. And so I want to make sure that we protect your right to use a firearm to hunt or to defend yourself in your home. But if it is a right to be able to rise up or stand against your government, I don't accept that. That's not my reading of it.
I mean, there is so much to unpack there. But basically what he's saying is he's rejecting history. He's rejecting everything that the founders stood for. He's rejecting everything that they wrote, which makes me wonder, has he read any of it? Chances are he hasn't, and I don't know that very many of these leftists actually have. And if he has, he clearly has no understanding of it. But I suppose there's a third option, and that third option is that he read it, he understands it, he's rejecting it because it is a check against the power that he and his leftist cronies are seeking. And they know that if they don't squash that, then they're not going to be able to attain the power that they so desire. And maybe it's a combination of all three. Maybe they haven't read it. It's shocking how many people in Congress either read it and disregard everything that it stands for. And by read it, I'm talking about the history behind the Constitution itself, the history behind it, the debates, the discussions, the correspondence between the founders, all of that goes into the Federalist Papers, all of that goes into our Constitution, and specifically the Second Amendment. Now, there's a lot more to that Robert Francis audio, and Calling on Noir actually does a really good job of breaking a lot of it down and really getting into it. He gets into it a lot deeper than we're going to here. There's a lot more things that I want to get to, and so we're just going to leave that there. Now, we are going to move on to some other topics, but for right now, we're going to stay with the gun control theme. But first, we're going to take a short break, and when we get back, we'll get into the hearings, the assault weapons ban hearings that were held this past week, and some of the highlights that came out of that. Stay tuned. So the House Judiciary Committee held some hearings this week over a couple of days, and one of the hearings was called Protecting America from Assault Weapons. Oh boy. So one of the things that we're hearing a lot lately is that the AR-15 is a weapon of war. Now, nothing could be further from the truth for a number of reasons. Not the least of which is that it was designed as a civilian weapon. Then the military went to Eugene Stoner, who was the man who developed the AR platform. They went to him and they wanted to get the plan so that they could develop it for military use, for combat use, which became the M16. But if we go with it and use the left's quote unquote logic, and I do use that term very, very loosely, then if the AR-15 is a weapon of war, then every weapon is a weapon of war. Bolt action rifles that were originally designed for military use are now owned by millions of Americans. And then on the flip side of that, the United States military has adopted firearms that were first in use by civilians. including the aforementioned AR-15, now the M16 and M4, the Winchester Model 70 and Remington Model 700 rifles, the Remington 870 and the Mossberg 500 shotguns. And then we have the pistols, the Beretta 92F, which has the M9 designation in the military, the SIG P320 pistol, which is the M17 in the military, the SIG P226, and the Glock 17 and 19. The 1911 was obviously, that was designed for the military, but it's in wide civilian use. Pretty much anyone who owns guns at this point has a 1911. I mean, the Marines are issued K-bar knives that have been used in combat. So are knives now going to be weapons of war that they want to ban? I wouldn't put it past them. But the proposed legislation to ban weapons of war, quote unquote, actually exempts the M1 Garand in both the rifle and carbine configurations. General George S. Patton once called this the greatest battle implement ever devised. So if they are really trying to ban weapons of war, why would they exempt that? Well, because for the uneducated, it's not scary looking. That's not the only reason. They want to ban guns altogether. But they're starting with the scariest looking one, even though there are far more powerful rifles out there, semi-automatic rifles, that they're not going to ban, like the M1 Garand, because they don't look scary, which is stupid. But during these hearings, I heard some of the questions, and the left is just unbelievably clueless when it comes to weapons. When it comes to guns, they're during a question to Diana Muller, and we'll get to some of her audio in a second, but during a question, Congressman Richmond from Louisiana actually referred to a gun called the AK-15. Seriously, dude? AK-15? Did he misspeak and trying to talk about an AK-47 or an AR-15? But if you're going to be in a congressional hearing, you would think you would at least have the terminology correct. And even if you misspeak, you're going to catch that. You're going to say, AK-47, or AR-15. No, he just kept it right on moving. Idiot. But when they're talking about weapons of war, when they're talking about these assault weapons bans, they are referring specifically to, not exclusively, but the image that every one of them has in mind is the AR-15. The most popular rifle in the country, and perhaps the world. Who knows? I haven't really dug into those numbers. The rifle is just so. Well, listen to what Amy Swearer had to say.
On the other hand, semi-automatic rifles like the AR-15 are so well suited for defensive action against threats in a civilian context that the Department of Homeland Security quite literally designates them as personal defense weapons for law enforcement officers. It is little wonder, then, that millions of law-abiding citizens in this country also choose these types of semi-automatic rifles as their own personal defense weapons. My mother did not grow up with firearms, and they will never be her favorite thing in the world. In fact, she'd never handled a firearm until I took her to the range for the first time several years ago. Now, I love my mother, but like every other novice with a handgun, she was quite bad. She struggled to hit a stationary target from 6 yards out under ideal conditions. And then she picked up an AR-15. And I watched my mother put a fist-sized grouping of lead in the center mass of a target from 20 yards out. That is why law-abiding citizens buy millions of these firearms. When accuracy and stopping power matter, they are simply better.
Now, here's the thing. The left is not, they're not trying to reduce crime. They're not trying to reduce gun violence. Because if they were, they would not be going after law-abiding citizens owning these rifles that account for less than 3% of all murders in this country. In fact, more murders are committed with hands, fists, hammers, clubs than these rifles. Any rifle. So if reducing crime was really the goal, if reducing gun violence was really the goal, this would be way down on the list of things they would go after. So that means there's another motive. And I think we can all look back to our conversation about Robert Francis O'Rourke to see what that might be. But another fabulous witness at this hearing was a woman by the name of Diana Muller. She is a former police officer, I believe 22 years on the job. And now she is a competitive shooter, a champion competitive shooter. And she's also the head of the DC Project, which is a Second Amendment advocacy group that encourages women to get out there and talk to their legislators and let them know that Second Amendment advocates are not the caricatures that the left likes to portray. And by that I mean guys who carry just because they can, guys who carry because they're compensating for something, or white supremacists, skinheads, whatever. But Second Amendment advocates are women who shoot recreationally, who carry to protect themselves, to protect their families, because they're exercising their God-given right to self-protection, self-preservation, by means of the Second Amendment. And she had this to say when it came to an assault weapons ban.
My goal here is to educate people. We are law-abiding, responsible gun owners, and please don't legislate the 150 million people just like me into being criminals. Because it has happened. You've already done it. The legislation on bump stocks. I was a bump stock owner, and I had to make a decision: do I become a felon, or do I comply? And like that gentleman that just got escorted out, I will not comply with the assault weapons ban.
She straight up told them, I will not comply. And I think she speaks for most, I would say 95, 97% of law-abiding gun owners who will not comply. How are they going to enforce it? They never address that. And then there will be a number of people whose weapons just might happen to be lost in a tragic boating accident. I don't know if you've seen those memes around, but Google it. It's pretty funny. But true. Because people are not going to want to give up the things that they use to protect themselves. Now, before we move on to some other topics of the day, I want to play you one last cut of Diana Muller and her testimony. And she said something that I've heard before, but in this context and in this venue where she said it, I think I would hope it would resonate with a lot. It's not, put it this way, it's not going to resonate with the people on the left who were in that room. That I can guarantee. But I think in the setting, I think it will resonate with a lot of Second Amendment advocates like myself, if they're not already familiar with it, and get some people fired up. Listen to this.
Freedom doesn't ask why the need. To quote William Pitt the Younger, necessity is the plea for every infringement on human freedom. It is the argument of tyrants. It is the creed of slaves.
I will not comply. Will you? I suspect that if you're listening to this, you will not. And for that, I thank you. Now, there was something I really wanted to get to, but I couldn't really get to it without mentioning this. And I didn't want to get into this because it's just so tedious. And of course, I'm talking about Ukraine Gate, whistleblower gate, whatever gate you want to call it. But the left is at it again. On July 25th of this year, the president had a phone call with Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. Now, someone in the White House took issue with what was said in this phone call and decided to blow the whistle, so to speak, and report an urgent concern under the Whistleblower Protection Act. Now, I've read both the whistleblower complaint and the transcript of the phone call. Now, let me get to the complaint first, because the first thing that jumped out at me when I read this was that it read like a legal document. It read like a lawyer prepared it. And reports are that it was submitted by a CIA analyst stationed at the White House for a period of time anyway. Now, it's unlikely that this analyst actually has a legal background sufficient to write this complaint. Whoever submitted this complaint clearly, very clearly, had help. Possibly someone in Congress. Possibly someone on the Select Committee on Intelligence, which is the body to which this complaint was submitted. Now, if you haven't read the report, if you haven't read the complaint, nowhere in it does it say, I heard the president say this. I read a document where the president ordered that. I overheard a conversation where the president ordered so-and-so to do this. Nothing like that. Nothing. Everything is, I heard from colleagues.
Heard it from a friend who heard it from a friend who heard it from another. You've been messing around.
I mean, seriously, that's what it boiled down to. On the first page, second bullet point, quote, I was not a direct witness to most of the events described. However, I found my colleagues' accounts of these events to be credible because, in almost all cases, multiple officials recounted fact patterns that were consistent with one another. In addition, a variety of information consistent with these private accounts has been reported publicly. Seriously? And he goes on in here to talk about tweets and news reports and stuff like that. Come on. This is hearsay. When you read I think it's 9 pages long. When you read it, some of it's secondhand, some of it's thirdhand even. I mean, it's just, this is not a whistleblower report. And in fact, the IG, the Inspector General, before this was released, came back and said that the so-called whistleblower may have an arguable political bias in favor of a rival political candidate. Now, you couple that with the hearsay element in this complaint, and it just stinks. And I've always been under the impression that a whistleblower should have some firsthand knowledge of whatever they're blowing the whistle on. Heard a conversation, seen certain conduct, read certain documents. And it turns out that this had actually been a requirement on the form that a whistleblower would actually submit. But also come to find out, sometime earlier this year, and I'm not exactly sure what the time frame is at this point. I've heard conflicting reports. But at some point earlier this year, that form had been changed to allow for secondhand information. So hearsay and rumor now qualifies as valid information protected under the Whistleblower Protection Act. What is that about? You could never get rumor admitted into evidence in court, and there are very, very, very limited circumstances under which hearsay would be allowed. Yet, before this complaint was even released, Nancy Pelosi went ahead and launched an impeachment inquiry. Well, quasi-launched an impeachment inquiry. She didn't bring it to a vote, so it kind of doesn't count. But still, the fact that she would even bring it up with no evidence. And then when the evidence does get released, she brought it up in anticipation of this evidence. And when it does get released, the evidence is no evidence at all. None. And I keep seeing on my social media feed, the president has committed treason and he needs to be impeached. Come on. For what? There is no... I've been having this discussion with a few people online for years now. They assert he needs to be impeached. I say, for what? Show me some evidence of a high crime or misdemeanor, and I'll be right there with you. But to date, nothing. Mueller report, zip. And this whistleblower complaint is the equivalent of Michael Avenatti's client, Julie Swetnick, accusing Brett Kavanaugh of sexual assault. It's that flimsy. And so in this instance, the treason is supposedly what? Trump asking Zelensky to look into CrowdStrike and what part it may have played in election interference in 2016. Come on. Was it especially wise to bring that up the way he did? I don't know. It seems pretty benign to me. Others think it was probably not the best approach. I don't know. Seems pretty benign to me. But either way, it wasn't illegal. And the media portrayal of this whole thing is some of the most dishonest reporting I have ever seen. They are outright lying. When they're talking about the transcript, they're leaving out hundreds of words between sentences to give an impression that something untoward happened when it didn't. There was no quid pro quo. There was no promise of anything. There was no statement that anything was going to be withheld in terms of aid. Nothing like that. And in fact, what the transcript does show is that the president was trying to look into the corruption and the interference that took place in the 2016 election, which is supposedly what the whole Mueller probe was about. But if you buy into the premise that there is some quid pro quo going on in this conversation, I like to think I can understand English pretty well, and I didn't see any, but maybe you can find some. But if we're going to go with that premise that there is quid pro quo, then what about what Joe Biden is on tape admitting? And we'll get into that after this quick break. So we've established that President Trump engaged in no quid pro quo on his phone call with Vladimir Zelensky. And even if you come up with some ridiculous interpretation of the transcript and somehow convince yourself that there was some quid pro quo going on there, or there was some pressure for Zelensky to do some nebulous favor for President Trump or the administration, it's a stretch. This, however, is not.
I remember going over convincing our team, or others too, convincing us that we should be providing for loan guarantees. And I went over for, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, no, I said, we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch. Got fired. And they put in place someone who was solid.
There is Biden on tape admitting to pressuring the Ukrainian president to replace the prosecutor who is investigating his son. Now we have Biden on tape admitting to this. And even if you believe that President Trump is guilty of engaging in similar conduct. Neither of it is illegal. As much as I wish Biden was on tape admitting to some sort of crime, he's admitting to being a dad that has a lot of power and doing whatever he could to help his son out. Is it right? No. Is it something that he wouldn't get away with if he were not the vice president or a high level, quote unquote high level government official? No. You or I couldn't get away with it. Even if we had the type of connections and pull, we couldn't get away with it. As unseemly as it is, it's not illegal, and it goes on all the time. And there probably are some instances where President Trump has done the exact same thing. And it's the way the game is played in international politics. And I'm not going to sit here and blow smoke and say that the president is absolutely squeaky clean and has never done anything like this whatsoever. I don't know that. My guess is he has. But so what? I can't sit here and be okay with the president doing it and then wanting to railroad Joe Biden for doing the exact same thing, for doing something that you or I, if we were in that type of position to help our children, we wouldn't do the same thing. Of course we would. So we've established that whatever went on was not illegal, therefore not treasonous on either party. But yet, the leftists in Congress are still up in arms that the president asked Zelensky to look into the situation. But hold on a second. Wait. Senators Robert Menendez, Dick Durbin, and Patrick Leahy sent a letter to Yuri Lutsenko, who is the general prosecutor for Ukraine. And in this letter, they ask 3 questions. 1, has your office taken any steps to restrict cooperation with the investigation by special counsel Robert Mueller? If so, why? 2, did any individual from the Trump administration or anyone acting on its behalf encourage Ukrainian government or law enforcement officials not to cooperate with the investigation by special counsel Robert Mueller? 3, was the Mueller probe raised in any way during discussions between your government and U.S. officials, including around the meeting of Presidents Trump and Poroshenko in New York in 2017? Blocking cooperation with the Mueller probe potentially cuts off a significant opportunity for Ukrainian law enforcement to conduct a more thorough inquiry into possible crimes committed during the Yanukovych era. This reported refusal to cooperate with the Mueller probe also sends a worrying signal to the Ukrainian people as well as the international community about your government's commitment more broadly to support justice and the rule of law. So President Trump is asking Zelensky to look into interference into our elections in 2016, which is supposedly what the left was after during the Mueller probe. And they're actually looking for the Ukrainian government to investigate President Trump. Like I said, this whole thing is getting tedious. This whole thing is tedious. They've been at this for years now and have nothing, absolutely nothing. And I think the American people are getting tired of it as well. And if they keep this up, especially going forward with impeachment and nonsense like that, they could be electing Republicans for the next 8 to 12 years. I'm okay with that. Now, even after all of this and the potential investigations that could be launched into Joe Biden and his son, Hunter Biden, and what went on there, Joe Biden's campaign is finished. And if you don't believe me, listen to this.
Well, in Iowa, the unemployment rate is 2.5%. People say they are employed in Iowa and their small businesses are growing. Iowa picked Trump by...
They were employed before he got elected.
The president won by 10 percentage points in Iowa.
I'm not suggesting he didn't win by 10 percentage points. What I'm suggesting is he's not the reason for the unemployment rate being down.
But why should people want to make a change, though?
Well, that's up to them to decide.
Why should they?
It's for them to decide.
Well, make your case.
I'm not going to.
I'm not going to? Well, you're not going to because you can't. And you can't, not because there isn't one to be made, because there are a number of other candidates that are at least attempting to. You can't because you can't. You don't have the capacity. And even with all the other nonsense notwithstanding, this right here is the reason why his campaign is finished. All right, y'all, we are way over time. I went very long talking about the Second Amendment and gun control, as I often do. But let's go ahead and get you out of here with another leftist demonstrating just how good a grasp they have on the subject of firearms. On this week's episode of
Galactically Stupid!
I give you Representative Sheila Jackson Lee.
I've held an AR-15 in my hand. I wish I had it. It is as heavy as 10 boxes that you might be moving. And the bullet that is utilized, a 50 caliber, these kinds of bullets, need to be licensed and do not need to be on the streets. 90% of the people want background checks. Over 60% want a ban on assault weapons. 80% plus want red flag laws. And I would venture to say those numbers would be similar for storage laws and for licensing laws regarding the question of firearms and ammunition. And finally, interestingly enough, Americans support the buyback program, which all of us could have in our respective communities.
Erroneous! Erroneous! Erroneous on both counts.
As heavy as 10 moving boxes and shoots a 50 caliber round. Okay. I don't know anyone that can carry 10 moving boxes. And yet she expects us to believe that she held one. Please. We'll probably get into all the other ridiculousness that she spouted in that clip, but unfortunately, we're out of time. So I would like to thank you all for listening. You can find us on Spreaker, Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, wherever you like to get your podcast content from. Please subscribe, leave a review, let us know what you think. We'd love to hear from you. You can also find us on the web. It's thelibertycast.net, where you can find all of the podcasts there, going back almost to the beginning. You can also find us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Parlay. It's at The Liberty Cast on all 4 platforms. So again, thank you all for listening. And until next time, keep your head on a swivel and stay safe, everybody.